Kelleher, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister and officials. And I note in your address, Minister, that you are challenging people, saying that nothing's being done. I think people know that work is being done. I think the challenge is it enough, and is it about the right actions and the right policy? So I think I worked for Cork Simon for 8 years. I was recently in touch with Cork Simon. They are flat out. They're one of the NGOs that's working with you. They are working extremely hard. In fact, they only get 50% of their funding from the state, and they are absolutely working night and day, and as are local authorities around the country. The critiques are about, is there inadequacy of response by the government to the scale of the crisis, and if the actions that are being taken are the right ones and in the right priority order. Now, my questions relate to Pillar 1, and it's about tackling homelessness, and it's in particular about a group within those figures, children, because I don't think you mentioned children specifically living in emergency accommodation. There's an estimated 3,800 children, possibly more, living in emergency accommodation. Minister, last month there were an unprecedented 2 joint Oireachtas reports presented here on the same day. I have copies of them, one from this committee and the other from the Children and Youth Affairs Committee. There was 14 recommendations in this committee's report, and there were 20 in the one from the Children and Youth Affairs. And again, I want to ask, Minister, because it wasn't clear from your statement, are you planning to act on all or any of the recommendations in these 2 reports within their recommendations or other measures that are available to you? The recommendations were extremely strong, extremely clear, and I would like to hear from you what your plans are there. Do you accept, Minister, the very detrimental effects, the adverse childhood experiences of living in homelessness? And it's worth pointing out that 70% of people that Cork Simon supported have experienced those early adverse childhood experiences. So the group that we're neglecting today are the group that will be homeless tomorrow. And it is really not just a blight on people's lives, but it is a cost to the state ultimately in the responses that we have to make. Do you accept that even more children in Ireland are living in cold and unhealthy environments? Do you accept the findings from the VDP report published earlier this week that a staggering 140,000 children are growing up in the cold, which found that 12.3% of children are living in fuel poverty, prone to ill health and illnesses that go with living in such conditions? This report revealed that 1 in 5 one-parent families were living in substandard accommodation, and 11% were in arrears with utility bills. The impact of homelessness and inadequate housing on children's health was spelt out by the Royal College of Physicians in another important report that was published in November. Growing up in the cold and the Royal College of Physicians report are in line with smaller but an important study, Born and Raised into Homelessness, undertaken by Young Knocknaheeny, a highly successful project based in Cork's north side promoting infant mental health, but whose work is undermined at every hand's turn by families living in substandard, unsafe and unsanitary and unhealthy living conditions. Landlords are receiving HAP money from the state for, quite frankly, slum conditions. This report cites a family with a child with special needs living in a HAP apartment where all 3 family members slept in the living area on sofas due to a large leak in the main bedroom window. We're, as a state, giving this landlord money. The second bedroom was damp because and the storage heater didn't work, and they were heating the apartment with a tumble dryer. The children living here were under 3, and there was the child living here was under 3 and had additional needs and was being supported by the physio and the speech and language therapist, but they couldn't actually help that much because of the state of the living conditions. So, returning to the 2 joint Oireachtas reports on child homelessness, what are you going to do about the recommendations? Are you heeding what fellow Oireachtas members recommended, what doctors recommended, and what frontline workers are telling you? At the very least, are you going to end the practice of one-night-only emergency accommodation, which is so very harmful to children? Think about it, Minister. When you were a boy, what kind of effect would you think a night-to-night existence would have had on you? Think about your anxiety levels. Think about getting to school, doing homework, playing, making friends, if you're going night to night from place to place. How can you eat properly? How can you begin to have a decent life? So, would Minister, as this committee recommended, are you going to end and cease the provision of one-night-only accommodation? And under Pillar 1, Rebuilding Ireland commits to appointing a dedicated child support workers for children experiencing homelessness. We know that from organisations working on the ground that almost 4,000 homeless children, that child support workers are hugely important to the 4,000 homeless children. The Ombudsman for Children made the same finding, and the Royal College of Physicians report said the same. It also found that 40% of children in homeless accommodation have clinically significant developmental, emotional and behavioural problems. It really, and I've also heard anecdotally, and I want to get to the bottom of it, that children living in emergency accommodation are not getting their vaccines because of some issues in terms of getting those vaccines to them. Now, I don't have my full facts here, but I will be coming back to that. We are letting children down. So these are the questions. Ending the practice, at least, of one-night-only accommodation, getting the child support workers to children, and how are you going to respond to those reports that this committee made, the other committee made, the Child and Youth Affairs, and the reports from the Royal College of Physicians and VDP and others. They're my questions.
Thank you, Senator. And of course, you can ask some further questions on the second round of questioning if you so wish. Minister, you have 5 minutes.
Chair, thank you, Senator, for your questions. Of course, we're letting children down. Any child in emergency accommodation is the state letting that child down. You know, in my opening statement, I mentioned families, but of course, we report on children in emergency accommodation every month. We saw, thankfully, that it was down in October, the number of children in emergency accommodation, but not enough, of course, not nearly enough. We also have the new quarterly reporting as well, and I've met many children in emergency accommodation. I've met them with their parents. I've met the families that have been transitioning from hotels into hubs, the families that have gone straight into hubs, the families that have come out of hubs into homes. I get to meet families at every stage of this process who are in crisis and housing insecurity, and it's very, very difficult for children in these circumstances. And indeed, one of the first conversations I had when I was Housing Minister, and I've said this a few times, was about the impact that was being discovered. And this was 2.5 years ago. So the research from the physicians is welcome, but it's not new information necessarily. I mean, 2.5 years ago, some of the leaders in this area were talking about the impact on children's motor neuron skills because of the types of accommodation that they were growing up in. And that's very serious. And that's a big part of the reason why the hub model was developed. And I'm sure, Senator, you've had a chance to visit family hubs and you've been able to see. Senator, I would dispute that completely, because when you compare a family hub to a hotel, it is far superior in terms of the additional space that is there, the wraparound supports that are there, the TUSLA workers, the supports. They're not homes. Of course they're not homes. No one's saying they're homes. They are the first response. They should be the only first response. We shouldn't be using hotels, but unfortunately we still are. But in a hub, you have the wraparound supports, you have the supports for the parents as well, which is important. You have play space, you have homework clubs, you have all of these things. And you also have, most importantly, children in hubs spending far less time in emergency accommodation than children in hotels. The average is 6 months. It shouldn't be there at all. With the hub programme, we've been able to reduce the time that families are spending in emergency accommodation, and we've been able to find sustainable pathways out of homelessness. This isn't about quick fixes, it's about getting people into their forever home. And that's what we do with the hub programme. Is what we're doing enough? No, it's not. It won't be enough until we've built enough homes. And that's why we talk about supply all the time and catching up with demand that is there at the moment. The funding for NGOs is interesting. I think a lot of people wouldn't realise that many of the big NGOs actually get more funding from the state than they get from voluntary contributions. That's because of the emphasis and the importance that we, as an Oireachtas and as a government, place on getting people out of emergency accommodation. But you see it in the spend that we have, in terms of the highest spend on record this year in terms of housing. You see it in the fact that we now have a department dedicated, and it wasn't just a rebrand. The environment function left the department and went into the Department of Communications. And you see it also in the results that we're now seeing, in terms of the number of new homes being built, the number of new homes being built by local authorities, the number of people being prevented from going into homelessness, which is really, really important, because they never have that experience that the children you talk about are having, and the children that I've met, and also the numbers in terms of, you know, that other element of homelessness, which is rough sleeping, and the results that we're seeing there. In relation to the reports that you talked about, There's a number of reports being done, which are very, very good, a number of recommendations in them. And at various times, so one of the more recent reports in the last few months, I met with the Children's Ombudsman to talk through the recommendations there to see how we could make sure that our understanding of the recommendations was the same as their understanding, so that when we went to go and implement them, that we would do that. My officials appeared very recently in front of the Children's Committee to talk about the recommendations coming from that report. So we're still reviewing some of them. Things like the Quality Standards Framework are now being rolled out nationally. We have talked about an inspections regime, and once we have the Quality Standards Framework in place...
Is this for hubs?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you see, we shouldn't have hubs in the first place. I'm sorry.
But,
okay,
Sandra,
it's better that
unless you can tell me where those families would be other than on the streets, then I don't know what to say to you, because we have to have some sort of accommodation until we get the home. We have to. I mean, we have to. It's why people criticise HAP. I criticise it myself. We shouldn't have to be depending on it to the extent that we are. But no homes are being built, practically. So until we get enough homes built, we have to care for people into some form of accommodation.
But isn't that the nub of the failure?
Yes, and that's a failure of the past. It's not a failure of the present. Because 23,000 new homes became available in the 12-month period up to, I think, Q3 of this year. It was under 10,000 before Rebuilding Ireland. So Rebuilding Ireland is increasing supply, and we have to continue to increase supply. But like I said previously, it's not enough, not yet. In relation to children or families that might be experiencing, fuel poverty, half of the social housing stock has been retrofitted since 2014. We have more work to do in retrofitting the social housing stock. There are a number of different supports available through the Department of Social Protection for families who have difficulty facing the bills. In relation to HAP households have to be inspected as part of the HAP agreement to make sure that they are up to standard, which is different to the private rental sector, though we are increasing inspections in the private rental sector. And in relation to the one-night only accommodation, that's not policy. But we have to have a contingency where it might arise at the last minute, a family might appear. We have to put them somewhere for the night so they're safe and they're not on the streets. And the next day we get them into something more permanent. So you have to have a contingency in place there, which is important. But it's not policy to have one-night only accommodation. The policy is hubs. The number of self-accommodating is down, which is good. And we do have key workers in place for families that are struggling. What we have found, and if you meet to some of the people working on the front line, or you speak to some of them, and I know you will, what we have found is some families that have come into emergency accommodation have difficulties that are not just about meeting the rent or not just about finding a place to live. They are, unfortunately, deeper than that. And they require more help and more support to get them sustainably out of homelessness. And that work is happening with those families. The important thing is that we have a joined-up approach across government. And one of the things that I did implement when I came in as Minister was an interagency group across government to make sure we have that joined-up approach. So when you have things like Housing First, we make sure it has the support of the Department of Health. When we're putting in a new detox facility for Dublin Simon on Ushers Island, it has the support for the Department of Health. When we're dealing with families who aren't aware of their status to remain, we're dealing with the Department of Justice. When I'm talking to the Child Ombudsman, we're talking about TUSLA, and so on. It's a whole of government approach.
Thank you very much, Minister.